What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected and accomplished actors walks into a television studio expecting a relaxed, friendly conversation, only to find himself cornered by sharp accusations, loaded questions, and deeply personal attacks? What unfolds when a routine promotional appearance suddenly turns into a public interrogation? What you're about to witness is not just another celebrity interview, but one of the most explosive, uncomfortable, and talked about moments in daytime television history. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe to the channel and drop your thoughts in the comments below, because what happened next caught everyone completely off guard. The studio lights were blazing hot, casting a harsh glow across the polished set of The View, as Jude Law calmly settled into his chair opposite the panel. He was a veteran of the press circuit, decades into a career filled with award-winning performances, critically acclaimed films, and countless interviews across the globe. From intimate indie dramas to massive Hollywood blockbusters, Jude had spoken to journalists, critics, and hosts of every style imaginable. Normally, interviews were second nature to him, but this time something felt off. There was a strange tension in the air, an unease that hung over the studio like an approaching storm. The usual chatter from the audience was muted, replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. Even before the first question was asked, Jude could sense it. The energy wasn't welcoming, it wasn't curious, it was sharp, almost predatory. "Welcome back to The View," Joy Behar announced, flashing her trademark smirk toward the camera. Longtime viewers knew that expression well. It was the look that signaled a conversation might veer away from polite small talk into something far more confrontational. We're here today with the incredibly talented Jude Law, who's joining us to talk about his latest film. Jude smiled politely, nodding in appreciation as the audience applauded. This was the part he expected: promotion, a few questions about the movie, maybe a humorous anecdote from the set. But before we get to that, Joy continued, tilting her head slightly. "Jude, I have to ask you something that's been bothering me." The applause faded instantly. The audience fell quiet. Jude shifted subtly in his seat, though his posture remained composed and professional. "Of course," he replied evenly. "Fire away." Joy leaned forward, her tone changing. "Your recent comments about American politics in that interview you did with The Guardian, they were quite something. You basically suggested that Americans don't understand nuance when it comes to international affairs." A ripple of shock moved through the studio. This wasn't entertainment. This wasn't light banter. This was an accusation. "That's pretty condescending, don't you think?" Joy pressed. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the other hosts appeared momentarily frozen, clearly aware that the interview had taken an unexpected and uncomfortable turn. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every micro-expression on Jude's face. His eyebrows lifted slightly, not in anger, but in genuine surprise. "I'm sorry, Joy," he said carefully, choosing his words with precision, "but I think there's been a misunderstanding here. I never said anything remotely close to that." Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Jude continued, still calm, still measured. "In fact," he said, "I specifically praised American audiences. I spoke about their curiosity, their openness, and their ability to engage with complex global stories. If anything, my comments were meant to acknowledge how thoughtful American viewers can be." The audience murmured. A few heads nodded, others glanced around, sensing that the narrative being pushed didn't quite align with the response they were hearing. Joy frowned slightly, flipping through her notes. "Well, that's not how it came across to a lot of people," she said. Jude leaned forward just a fraction, not aggressively, but confidently. With respect, he replied, "There's a difference between encouraging deeper conversation and insulting an entire nation. I would never do the latter." The tension in the studio thickened. The interview that was supposed to highlight a film had now become a debate about words, intent, and perception. Jude remained composed, refusing to be baited into defensiveness or hostility. Instead, he spoke with clarity, correcting the record without raising his voice. Some audience members began to applaud softly, sensing that this was no longer about entertainment, it was about fairness. As the segment continued, it became clear that Jude Law had walked into the studio expecting a warm exchange. but found himself navigating a verbal ambush instead. Yet rather than reacting emotionally, he chose calm, dignity, and reason, and in doing so, he shifted the tone of the entire room. What began as an attempted takedown slowly transformed into a moment of unexpected resistance, one where composure proved stronger than confrontation and clarity cut through accusation. And that's exactly why this interview didn't just fade into daytime TV history. It became a moment people are still talking about. "Oh, come on now," Joy interrupted, waving her hand dismissively, as though brushing away something trivial rather than responding to a serious clarification. "Don't backtrack. You said, and I quote, that American viewers need everything spelled out for them because they can't handle complex narratives. That is absolutely not what I said," Jude replied firmly. His British accent, usually soft and measured, became more pronounced as frustration crept into his voice. "I would never make such a blanket statement about any audience, least of all American audiences, who have supported my work for decades. That interpretation is a distortion, not a quotation." Joy leaned forward in her chair, clearly enjoying the tension she had helped manufacture. Her smile was sharp, almost predatory. "So you're saying The Guardian misquoted you? That's convenient. Or maybe you just don't want to own up to what you actually think about the people who buy tickets to your movies?" "I'm saying you're misrepresenting my words entirely," Jude shot back. His voice remained controlled, but there was now a noticeable edge of steel beneath the calm. "I spoke about the universal challenges of storytelling across cultures, how nuance can sometimes be lost when films cross linguistic and cultural boundaries. Nothing more. If you're going to quote me, at least have the courtesy to quote me accurately." The other panelists exchanged uncomfortable glances. This was clearly not going according to the show's usual script. What was meant to be a light promotional interview had turned into something far more aggressive, almost interrogational. Even the audience, which had initially reacted with amused murmurs, began to shift uneasily in their seats. "Courtesy?" Joy repeated, letting out a laugh that carried no warmth. "That's rich coming from someone who thinks Americans are too stupid to understand his artistic vision." Jude inhaled slowly, visibly steadying himself. "I never said that, not once, and I would appreciate it if you stopped putting words in my mouth simply to provoke a reaction. Tell me, Jude." Joy continued, ignoring his request. "Is that why you left Hollywood for a while? Because you couldn't stand working with all of us simple-minded Americans?" Jude's jaw tightened, the muscle flickering beneath his skin. For a moment, he looked as though he might finally snap, but instead, he straightened in his chair and met her gaze directly. "I find your line of questioning not only inaccurate," he said slowly, "but deliberately inflammatory. I've never expressed anything but gratitude and respect for American audiences and the American film industry. This country gave me opportunities I'll always be thankful for. But you did leave." Joy pressed on, refusing to let the moment settle. "Right after that string of box-office disappointments, Alfie, All the King's Men, The Holiday did okay, I guess, but let's be honest. Your American career wasn't exactly setting the world on fire, was it?" A ripple of reaction passed through the audience. Some gasped softly, others leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. Jude paused, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to reclaim control of the room. "My career choices," he began carefully, "have always been based on the quality of the material, not opening, weekend numbers, or tabloid narratives. Success isn't a straight line, and it certainly isn't defined by one market or one phase of a career." Joy smirked. "That sounds like a very elegant way of saying you couldn't hack it." "No," Jude replied calmly. "It's a realistic way of describing a career that spans decades, continents, and creative risks. Some projects resonate more than others. That's true for every actor who's ever worked in this industry, including the ones you praise." For the first time, Joy hesitated. The audience sensed the shift. Jude wasn't defensive anymore. He was resolute. "I stepped away from Hollywood because I wanted to grow," he continued. "I wanted to challenge myself with roles that didn't fit neatly into a commercial box. That wasn't a rejection of America. It was an exploration of my craft." One of the other panelists attempted to interject, but Joy waved them off, unwilling to surrender control. "So you're saying American films aren't challenging enough for you?" she asked, seizing for another angle. "I'm saying," Jude responded evenly, "that good storytelling exists everywhere, and so do limitations. To frame that as contempt for an audience is not only dishonest, it's lazy." The studio fell silent. Even the cameras seemed to linger longer on Jude now, capturing the quiet intensity in his expression. "I've worked with American filmmakers who are among the most intelligent, daring artists I've ever known," he added. "And I've been embraced by American audiences in ways I'll never forget. To suggest otherwise is a narrative you're creating, not one I've lived." Joy leaned back, crossing her arms. "Well, some people might say this sounds like damage control." Jude smiled faintly, though there was no amusement in it. Some people can say whatever they like, but facts don't change simply because confrontation makes for good television. The audience erupted into applause, not thunderous, but steady and unmistakable. It was no longer clear who was on trial. The opportunity to work with talented people, Jude responded, choosing his words with care. His diplomatic training as an actor was serving him well, even in the face of obvious provocation. Years of press tours, hostile interviews, and carefully constructed media narratives had taught him how to remain composed under pressure. "I've been fortunate to work on both sides of the Atlantic, with extraordinary directors, writers, and fellow actors. That experience has shaped me creatively and professionally." "That's a very political answer." Joy smirked, tilting her head slightly. "Very safe, very British, I suppose. Always so proper, even when you're being criticized." The tension in the studio was now unmistakable. It sat heavy in the air, thick enough to be felt by everyone present. The audience had grown unusually quiet, sensing that the interview had crossed an invisible line. Jude could feel the heat of the studio lights pressing down on him, but more than that, he felt the deliberate attempt to corner him, to push him into saying something careless, something headline-worthy, something he would regret the moment the cameras stopped rolling. "I prefer to be thoughtful rather than reactive," Jude said carefully, keeping his tone measured. "Unlike some people, I don't believe that television gives anyone a license to be deliberately hostile toward their guests." Joy's eyes flashed instantly. "Hostile?" she shot back. "I'm asking legitimate questions here. You came on our show. You should be prepared to answer tough questions. This isn't some fluffy British talk show where everyone's going to pat you on the head and tell you how wonderful you are. There's a difference." Jude replied, his voice rising slightly for the first time, between asking tough questions and misrepresenting someone's words in order to manufacture conflict where none exists. A subtle murmur rippled through the audience before falling into complete silence. Jude leaned forward slightly now, no longer content to simply defend himself. "You've built this entire line of questioning," he continued, "on a false premise." "False premise?" Joy scoffed, folding her arms. "I read the interview myself. You talked about how British actors have to dumb down their performances for American audiences. That is completely untrue," Jude said, his composure finally beginning to crack. The careful restraint he had maintained throughout the interview was now giving way to visible frustration. "I challenge you to produce that quote, because it doesn't exist." Joy opened her mouth to interrupt, but Jude continued, his voice firmer now. "What you're doing right now is exactly the kind of gotcha journalism that gives American media a bad reputation. You're not interested in clarification. You're interested in confrontation." The studio audience was dead silent. Even the cameras seemed to linger, as if aware they were capturing something unscripted, something raw. No one shifted in their seat. No one laughed. This was no longer entertainment. It was a reckoning. "Gotcha journalism," Joy repeated, her voice rising to match his. "I'm doing my job, which is holding celebrities accountable for their words and actions." "Accountability," Jude replied sharply, "requires accuracy." Joy leaned forward again, clearly irritated now. "Just because you're used to being treated like royalty doesn't mean you get a free pass here." A few audible gasps escaped from the audience. Jude's expression hardened, not with arrogance, but with resolve. "I've never asked for a free pass," he said. "I've asked for fairness. There's a difference, and conflating the two says more about your approach than it does about my character." Joy scoffed again, shaking her head. You actors are all the same. The moment someone challenges you, suddenly it's unfair. That's not true, Jude countered. I welcome criticism. I welcome debate. What I don't accept is having my words twisted to fit a narrative that's more convenient for television drama than it is for truth. For a brief moment, Joy seemed at a loss for words. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the faint hum of studio equipment. I've spent my career trying to tell honest stories, Jude continued, his voice steady once more. Stories that resonate across cultures, across borders. To suggest that I, or anyone, views an entire audience as incapable or inferior is not only false, it's insulting, and frankly, it's beneath this conversation. Joy leaned back in her chair, lips pressed tightly together. The smirk was gone now, replaced by something closer to irritation, perhaps even unease. Well, she said after a pause, people can draw their own conclusions. Indeed they can, Jude replied calmly. And they will based on what they actually hear, not what they're told to believe. The audience finally erupted into applause, not loud or celebratory, but sustained and deliberate. It was the sound of recognition, of watching someone refuse to be baited, refuse to surrender their integrity for the sake of spectacle. Joy forced a thin smile, glancing toward the camera. We'll have to leave it there. But it was clear to everyone in the room that something had shifted. This wasn't just another uncomfortable interview. It was a moment where the power dynamic cracked, where the guest refused to play the role assigned to him. And for the first time that evening, Joy looked less like the one asking the questions, and more like the one being quietly judged. The phrase "treated like royalty" hung in the air, dripping with irony, as Jude Law's voice suddenly cut through the studio with a sharpness that made everyone sitting under those hot lights straighten in their chairs. Gone was the calm, diplomatic actor who had walked onto the set just minutes earlier. What stood in his place was a man pushed past the limits of patience. You want to talk about accountability, Jude said firmly, his words slicing through the tense silence. Then let's start with your accountability to basic journalistic integrity. A collective intake of breath rippled through the audience. For the last 5 minutes, he continued, locking eyes with Joy, you've been attacking me based on quotes that do not exist, statements I never made, opinions I never expressed. Joy didn't flinch. If anything, she seemed energized by the confrontation. She waved her hand dismissively and leaned back in her chair. Oh, please, she scoffed, spare me the lecture about journalism. I've been doing this longer than you've been making movies, sweetheart, and I know deflection when I see it. Deflection, Jude repeated, the word landing heavy. He leaned forward now, his famed composure visibly cracking. The polished interview persona had completely fallen away. You want me to defend statements I never made, he said, his voice rising just enough to signal genuine anger. That's not deflection. That's refusing to participate in a manufactured controversy. Manufactured? Joy laughed, the sound sharp and mocking, echoing uncomfortably across the studio. Everything's manufactured with you people, isn't it? The humble British actor routine. The wounded dignity the moment someone dares to call you out. The audience shifted in their seats. The other hosts glanced at one another, their expressions tight and uneasy. You think that accent makes you sound more intelligent than the rest of us? Joy pressed on. Is that what this is? A murmur of discomfort spread through the crowd. Jude paused, visibly restraining himself. When he spoke again, his voice was tight, controlled, but burning underneath. My accent has absolutely nothing to do with this conversation, he said. What does have something to do with it is your apparent inability to conduct a professional interview without resorting to personal attacks and fabricated quotes. Personal attacks? Joy shot back, her voice rising dangerously close to a shout. You want to see a personal attack? The temperature in the room seemed to spike. Let's talk about your personal life, she continued relentlessly. 3 different women, multiple children with different mothers, but sure, lecture me about professionalism. The studio fell into stunned silence. Even for the view, this was a line that felt unmistakably crossed. The audience froze, the cameras lingered, one of the co-hosts visibly swallowed, clearly unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Jude's face drained of color for a split second, then flushed red with fury. You are completely out of line, he said, his voice shaking with barely restrained anger. Oh, am I? Joy shot back without hesitation. My family has nothing to do with this, doesn't it, though? She continued mercilessly. You want to talk about American values. You want to lecture us about sophistication. In America, we value family stability. We value men who take responsibility for their actions. How dare you? Jude said, rising slightly from his seat before forcing himself back down. How dare you drag my children into this? His voice cracked, not with weakness, but with raw, unfiltered rage. They have done absolutely nothing to deserve being used as props in your petty attempt to manufacture drama for ratings. Petty? Joy snapped, leaning forward now, refusing to yield. This isn't petty. This is accountability. No, Jude replied sharply. This is exploitation. The audience began murmuring loudly now. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others stared wide-eyed, transfixed by the unfolding chaos. The producers behind the cameras were undoubtedly panicking, but no one called for a break. You invited me here to talk about a film, Jude continued, his words gaining strength, not to stand trial for a narrative you invented, not to defend my children from someone who thinks cruelty passes for journalism. Joy rolled her eyes dramatically. You celebrities always do this. The moment you're challenged, suddenly it's everyone else's fault. Challenged, Jude shot back. I welcome thoughtful challenge. What I don't accept is character assassination disguised as commentary. The room was electric now, every word landing like a spark on dry tinder. For years, Jude said, his voice steady but blazing, I've spoken openly, respectfully, and thoughtfully in interviews across the world. Never once have I needed to tear someone else down to make a point. He looked directly at Joy, and I won't start today. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. Even Joy seemed momentarily caught off guard, not by his anger, but by the clarity and conviction behind it. This was no longer an interview. It was a reckoning. What began as a supposed discussion had transformed into one of the most jaw-dropping confrontations ever seen on daytime television. And as the cameras continued rolling, one thing was undeniable. Jude Law had walked into the studio expecting conversation, but he had been forced into a battle for dignity instead, and the world was watching. That's not tough questioning, Jude said, his voice shaking with barely restrained fury. That's character assassination. Character assassination. Joy stood up abruptly now, matching his energy step for step. You don't have any character to assassinate. You're just another privileged actor who thinks the world owes him respect he hasn't earned. Respect I haven't earned. Jude's voice rose sharply, loud enough to echo across the studio walls. I've worked for 30 years in this industry. 30 years. I've never once been involved in a scandal. I've never once attacked a fellow actor. I've never once used my platform to tear down others the way you're doing right now. The audience sat frozen, barely breathing. This was no longer an interview. It was a confrontation unraveling in real time. Oh, you want to talk about platforms? Joy's eyes lit up with malicious glee, as if she'd been waiting for this opening. Let's talk about how you use yours. Coming to America, taking roles from American actors, then running back to Britain and talking about how unsophisticated we are. That never happened, Jude said through gritted teeth, every word forced out with effort. You are literally making things up as you go along. Am I? Joy shot back. She reached down and snatched a stack of papers from the desk in front of her. Because I have the interview right here. Then read it. Jude challenged instantly. Read the actual quote you're claiming exists. Read it word for word, right now, on live television. Joy's hand hovered over the papers. For the briefest moment, her confident expression flickered. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The certainty that had carried her through the entire attack suddenly wavered under the weight of direct accountability. Well, Jude pressed, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. You've been quoting this interview for the last 10 minutes. Surely you can find the exact words you claim I said. Joy shuffled through the papers, her movements growing increasingly frantic. Pages slid against each other. Her fingers trembled slightly as she scanned line after line, avoiding eye contact with both Jude and the camera. The other hosts watched in stunned silence. No one spoke. No one moved. What had been a carefully constructed ambush was now visibly beginning to collapse. It's in here somewhere. Joy muttered under her breath, her voice barely picking up through the microphone. "No, it isn't," Jude said quietly, deadly calm replacing his earlier anger. "Because I never said what you're claiming." Joy flipped another page. Then another. The rustling of paper sounded absurdly loud in the otherwise silent studio. "You said," she began, then stopped. Jude took a step forward. "No," he said firmly. "What you said I said is not the same thing, and now you're finding out, live on air, that you can't back it up." Joy's jaw tightened. The audience could feel the shift. This was the moment where the narrative broke, where accusation demanded evidence, and none appeared. "You implied," Joy tried again. "Implication is not a quote," Jude snapped. "Tone is not a statement, and your discomfort with my success does not give you the right to invent words and attribute them to me." Joy looked up briefly, her eyes flashing with irritation and something else. "Panic, you're twisting this," she said. "You know exactly what you meant." "No," Jude replied. "What you mean is what you want me to have meant, and that difference matters." Another long silence stretched across the studio. Somewhere off camera, a producer could be seen gesturing nervously, but no one dared interrupt. "You accused me," Jude continued, his voice steady but unyielding, "of insulting an entire country. You accused me of arrogance, hypocrisy, and contempt, and when asked to prove it, all you have is paper you can't read from." Joy slammed the stack of papers back onto the desk. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You're playing semantics." "No," Jude said, "I'm playing truth." A ripple passed through the audience, not applause, yet, but recognition, the kind that comes when someone sees a mask slip. "You talk about privilege," Jude went on, "but what's more privilege than sitting in that chair, protected by a microphone and a countdown clock, knowing your guest can't check you in real time?" Joy opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. "I earned my career," Jude said. "I earned my reputation, and I won't stand here while you dismantle it using fiction." Joy forced a laugh, but it rang hollow. "This is unbelievable." "Yes," Jude agreed quietly. "It is." The studio remained locked in silence. The confrontation had reached a point of no return. What began as an attack had turned into exposure, not of Jude, but of the process itself. Joy straightened her posture, attempting to reclaim control. "We're moving on," she said sharply. "No," Jude replied. "You're moving on because you can't finish what you started." The cameras lingered, the moment stretched, and for the first time that night, the power in the room had unmistakably shifted.